So why is Tawheed, that is divine oneness, so important in the Islamic tradition and in other traditions? It pops up all over the place in mystical traditions, philosophical traditions, the world over, including in certain schools of Hinduism, Hermeticism, Platonism, various philosophical schools of monism in the early modern period and modern period, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, what's the big deal? Why is this such a ubiquitous thing that comes up? And it's actually pretty similar to how we reason, or I should say the reason why it comes up is because it's the conclusion of a type of, you could say scientific thinking. It's very similar to how scientists think. That, while our modern scientific method has certain unique features and combinations and what have you, and institutions that run it a certain way, many of the ways of thinking in science are by no means new. So ancient peoples had a similar idea, for instance, or a similar way of thinking about, if we want to better understand something complicated, we have to sort of narrow it down to its variables. We have to narrow down the variables, reduce the variables, to get at the core reality of what's going on. So, an example might be like thinking of light and dark. Light and dark, we can reduce that to we can understand that maybe we think of it as light and the lack of light or something. So they're kind of like two sides of the same coin, or hot and cold are both two sides of the same coin of temperature, for instance, which is, the kinetic energy of particles, I guess. I may be slightly inaccurate on that, but something like that. So this kind of idea of finding out that two things in nature can be, when we understand them more deeply, we understand them to be two sides of the same coin. So, a great example is electricity and magnetism. Physicists nowadays say when you understand them better, you understand that the underlying phenomenon is electromagnetism, which in some cases looks to us like electricity, and in some cases looks to us like magnetism. So, ancient thinkers and modern ones as well have sort of done this with everything, with every concept and every the whole universe or what have you, and so they kind of come to this conclusion that when we understand things like perfectly or completely, theoretically, we don't, but theoretically it must reduce down to a single variable. The same way, say, physicists are looking for the single equation, perhaps. That will, determine the how the universe behaves. But I guess in a different way, I think we might think like, we don't, a lot of thinkers would think, we don't expect the fundamental underlying phenomenon to be an equation, because there are so many things that don't seem to act simply by equations. Maybe, and we see, for instance, animate and inanimate objects in the world, living things and non-living things. So perhaps the underlying reality is something that can be kind of seen. It's neither living nor non-living, and it's kind of beyond that, or it's some sort of, those categories break down. You know what I'm saying? And that's something we see even just in science. But so when it comes to a lot of kind of philosophical things, one of the most basic sort of things that our cognition, one of the basic distinctions that our cognition can make about the world, comes down to sameness or difference, or also kind of connected to that is oneness and manyness. But just in the same way that we realize that, okay, light and dark cannot kind of be understood, they sort of rely on each other. They're both part of a spectrum, I guess. And just in the same way that temperature, hot and cold are just two different manifestations of temperature, you could say, there's the theory is that kind of like, oneness and manyness, they also rely on each other, because when we encounter it in the world, oneness, presumes that something, this hat to be one hat presumes that, there are things outside of the hat, and that the hat could be theoretically cut in half or what have you. But there are things that distinguish it from the outside world that make it one hat. And likewise, manyness is obviously made up of many ones that come together to form a many, etc. So, but then philosophers and thinkers of many types have kind of come to the conclusion that, well, if oneness and manyness, this very basic distinction, which is kind of the limits of our reason, that's kind of the one of the most basic distinctions our logic can make, there must be something underlying that is beyond our reason, but that is sort of makes those two things, manyness and sameness, two sides of the same coin, of this like sort of hyper unity or there's oneness, manyness, whatever you want to call it, and that sort of inconceivable or logically ungraspable theoretical thing that underlies sameness and difference, or manyness and oneness, that is what is often thought of as, in Platonic thought, the One, which we find again in the Islamic tradition as one of the names of Allah, Al-Wahid, the One. And that concept is, it's found, that type of thinking is found in a lot of the monotheistic traditions of the world, including the Islamic one. It's very central to the Islamic tradition. And so the Tawheed of Islam is not just about one in the sense of, a God that could, it's not a polytheism that has been chopped down to one God. That's sort of like a henotheism, you could say, where it's like, theoretically there could be other gods, but there's actually only one. So the true Tawheed, the La ilaha illallah, the spiritual sort of importance of that is that it's not just about a literal number one God, but rather that the one God is this underlying reality that gives rise, that is beyond the reach of our logic, but at the same time we kind of intuit that it must be there, at least when we're just talking about the logical side of things. It must be there, because otherwise how would you have these other dichotomies kind of that rely on each other? And we find an example, for instance, of Ibrahim alayhi salam, Abraham, being portrayed in the Quran as sort of reasoning his way to Tawheed like this, where he sees reasoning his way to divine unity like this. He sees, the stars and says, "Are these my Lord?" And then he realizes, no, they are kind of subject to laws beyond themselves. Their behavior is determined by something beyond them. And then he sees, the moon. Oh, this is greater and brighter, but it too comes and rises and sets, and then the sun, and then this too rises and sets. And then finally he realizes that the one beyond all these things is the Lord of the universe. And so that's why Abraham is called a Hanif, which is, this kind of primordial, primordial monotheism that is found even outside of the Abrahamic traditions. God willing, we can talk about that more about that another time. But for now, just suffice it to say that, so Tawheed is not literal, Tawheed in the sense of the divine oneness in Islam, and in many other traditions. It's not just about literal oneness of a God, literal one in the way we encounter it in the physical world, but this hyper unity that underlies and gives rise to, makes possible both oneness and manyness.